Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Josh Veers. I am the campus director for Citrus and the Bonnetown Institute at UC Merced. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started just because we have a lot to talk about. So welcome to the 13th year of the Citrus Research Exchange Seminar Series and 21 years of the Citrus organization. We've hosted a remarkable lineup of technology innovators in person at Satarjidai Hall, and are glad to see all of you now joining virtually for the final talk of the Fall 2021 series. Please be sure to check the Citrus website mid-January for the Spring 2022 Research Exchange speaker lineup, whether that's in person, virtual, or hybrid to be determined. But definitely check out citrus-uc.org events to learn more about next spring's lineup. It's my great pleasure to invite up to the podium Dr. Laurel Larsen, who's worked in academia since she earned her PhD at the University of Colorado, and that was in 2008. She went on to work with USGS and the National Research Program that was part of the Hydroecology of Flowing Waters project. She continued her work with USGS until 2016, working on a variety of different research topics, including hydrogeomorphology of restored and unrestored streams. That was in the Chesapeake Bay. She went on to do quite a bit of work in the Florida Everglades. And if you followed her work, you'll see that she's published extensively in PNAS, Ecology Letters, WRR, a number of other great venues. It's no surprise that she was brought onto the faculty at Berkeley, first as an assistant professor in the Department of Geography, and then as an associate professor for both geography and the civil and environmental engineering departments. She is now the lead scientist, the Delta lead scientist for the Delta Science Program. That happened in April of 2020. She is the 7th person and the first woman to lead that program since its creation in 2009. Her research focuses on the fields of hydrology, geomorphology, environmental fluid mechanics, complex systems, environmental modeling, aquatic ecology, restoration ecology, and a number of other things. These are precisely the fields that we need to bring together to solve California's water issues. So I'm very excited to hear about her talk today, The Drought Cascade, Linking Changes in Climate Extremes to Changes in Watershed Function. Thank you, Laurel. It's all yours.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to speak to you all today. Let me just get my screen share going and verify that you can all see my screen. Is that correct?
You're good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to tell a two-part story today, both united by themes of hydroclimatic extremes and in particular drought. In the first part, I'm going to highlight some hot on the press work that we've done in my research group at Berkeley to evaluate trends in hydrologic extremes as an outcome of a data set synthesis. This part of the story is going to take a stab at the question of how we go from climatic extremes to changes in streamflow extremes, which includes floods as well as drought, though given my title, I'm going to be preferentially emphasizing drought. The second part of my talk will take a look at how drought is impacting our backyard here in the California Delta, and what is happening at the Delta Science Program to address some of the big uncertainties. So I really wanted to highlight both of my current roles to all of you today. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge support from the work, and in particular, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and USGS Powell Center for Analysis and Synthesis supported the synthesis part of the story that I'll be telling you today. That work is also detailed in a paper that just got accepted by hydrological processes yesterday. So the timing for this was really good. And that paper was led by my PhD student, Liang Zhang. So I'm giving her all of the credit for the first part of the story that I'll be telling you today. And then I want to thank the USGS and the Delta Stewardship Council for supporting my role as Delta lead scientist. So getting back to the heart of the matter, as you all know, a big focus for environmental scientists and climate scientists in general for decades has been extreme events. We've all heard at this point that climate change is going to make extreme events more extreme and also more frequent. So I'm just going to start out the talk today with some basic insight as to why that is, to get us all on the same page. It's going to be a bit brief and oversimplified given the time, but it also provides a glimpse into the window through which hydrologists think about these processes and climatic extremes. So for many years, scientists have been aware that that warming temperatures is going to drive enhanced evapotranspiration, which is going to drive more frequent drought. This is a really old paper from JGR Atmospheres in 1990 that used current GCM models at that time to show that extreme drought that had a 5% probability of occurrence in 1990 would go up to a 50% probability of occurrence in 2050. Now, we're more than halfway there from the time this paper was published. And indeed, the data that we are seeing does back up that general idea. In other words, the observational record shows that warmer temperatures are driving more severe drought. This is a pretty iconic paper that Noah Diffenbaugh put out in 2015 in PNAS that used data coming from California specifically that shows that if we look at temperature anomalies and precipitation anomalies over the past century, we see a pretty even spattering of data points across these four quadrants. But if we look at just the past 20-ish years up to the point this paper was written, then we do see that many of these points are falling into this quadrant, which is defined by high temperature anomalies. And so one of the main conclusions to come out of this paper is that the droughts that we've been seeing recently in California are not driven by extraordinary low precipitation so much as they are being driven by extraordinarily high temperatures. And he claims that those higher temperatures are making our droughts more severe. At the same time, though, there's an opposing tendency that changing climate is driving, which is a tendency towards more intense precipitation events and higher volume precipitation events. To understand why this is happening, you need only go to the very basic Clausius-Clapeyron equation, which dictates how much moisture a parcel of air is able to hold over a range of temperatures. And it's a very simple equation that shows that warmer air holds more moisture than cooler air. And so the deduction then is that under warming temperatures, we are going to see more intense rain because the atmosphere can hold more moisture. So what do we see in the data? Many of the data points that have been collected in Japan, which is where this study that I'm showing comes from, as well as other places such as the Netherlands, have shown that over a range of temperatures, we do see a scaling that roughly conforms to the slope of the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. But also, surprisingly, over a range of temperatures from about 16 degrees Celsius to 24 or so degrees Celsius, we see that many of these data points actually follow a steeper relationship that is approximately 2 times that expressed in the Clausius-Clapeyron equation. And there's been a lot of speculation about why this is in the literature. Most of that thinking is that there are positive feedbacks that this enhanced hydrologic cycle sets up associated with mesoscale convection. So basically, once you start raining, you set up a convection cycle that promotes even more evapotranspiration and additional rainfall. So we have these two competing processes, and then the question is, how do these two competing processes play out at a global scale and affect hydroclimatic extremes in general? And, you know, in putting together this talk, I was reflecting on how early in my tenure at Berkeley, which I actually was simultaneously working at USGS in Berkeley for a number of years. So I started at Berkeley in 2013. But early on in my tenure at Berkeley, I was sitting in a seminar room listening to a talk by a hydroclimatologist talking about the wet will become wetter and the dry will become drier paradigm. And that was something that was widely expressed at the time. Now climatologists are realizing that that paradigm doesn't necessarily apply over land while it does hold over ocean, and that a more nuanced paradigm, which has been called the drier-in-dry and wetter-in-wet paradigm, really describes what's happening over land a little bit better. And the basic idea here is that if you take dry regions, and hopefully you all can see my cursor, if you take dry regions, it's not the case that all land areas within those regions are going to become drier, but rather that where we do see drying trends, they tend to occur in regions that are dry overall. And where we do see wetting trends, they do tend to occur in wetter regions. Now, the plot that you're looking at here is based on satellite sensed soil moisture. But a big question is, how is this reflected? How does this really play out in the stream flow story? Well, we think we might know what the implications of hydroclimatology will be for stream flow, but there have been a few surprises when you really get into the data. And one somewhat surprise is that low stream flow extremes, or trends in low stream flow extremes, such as trends in minimum daily stream flow, don't necessarily conform to that drier-in-dry, wetter-in-wet paradigm. So this is from a fairly recent publication in Geophysical Research Letters that shows that red here indicates drying, but minimum daily stream flow is becoming drier in many parts of the humid east. And then conversely, there's a lot more variability in the west, but there are many parts of the more arid west that are becoming wetter in terms of their minimum daily stream flow. This paper also found that rather than seeing increases in both wet and dry extremes at single locations as quantified through stream flow, which is something that the IPCC has formerly predicted, what we're seeing is that whole stream flow distributions are shifting in those particular places. Another surprise is that while climate models, such as those used by the IPCC, have predicted a tight correlation between extreme precipitation events and extreme stream flow events, in reality, we're seeing a low correlation between these types of extremes. Here's a recent paper in Geophysical Research Letters that quantifies this correlation across a number of stations throughout the US. And you'll see that in general, the maximum correlation tends to be around 0.6, but many of these points have much lower correlations of around 0.4. So what's going on here? And in fact, I'll also point out before I move on that there was a paper that came out in 2018 by Sharma et al. That called this low correlation one of the grand challenges for hydrology. So what's going on here? There's been a lot of discussion on this in the hydrological literature, a lot of thinking about this. And one thing that has come out of this discussion is that if we want to consider how climatic extremes translate into streamflow extremes, we really need to be considering soil moisture and snow. As we all know here in California, having lived through several droughts recently, watersheds act as sponges. And if those sponges dry out, there's a lot of accommodation space for water within the soil column. And that accommodation space needs to be filled. The sponge needs to be wetted before you're going to start generating runoff to streams. So this paper by, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, Berkeley et al. In 2016, in Geophysical Research Letters, looked at dominant mechanisms associated with flood generation. All the green points here invoke considering this antecedent moisture in catchments, this soil moisture storage. And that was really important to consider across a broad swath of the US. Another paper that was focused on Australian catchments tested the conceptual idea that soil moisture is more important to consider for floods that are less frequent. And they collected data, observational data from a number of catchments, and that basically confirmed this conceptual model and showed that the break point here is around 10 years. So soil moisture seems to be really important. Other storage mechanisms like snow also seem to be really important. But for the most part, we lack observational data on these processes. Soil moisture is not something that is broadly collected despite many calls for it in hydrology. Snow is also really difficult to quantify. It's very heterogeneous within a watershed. And so it's really difficult to test these ideas based on observational data. Fortunately, though, our hydrologic community has been investing in large scale sensor networks that collect data on all aspects of the water balance. These include critical zone observatory sites that were funded by NSF and are now under the umbrella of COASI. Many long-term ecological research sites also collect this sort of information. And then there are hydrologic observatories that are run by universities, including the UC system, which runs Sage Hen Creek. However, like many sensor networks in the environmental sciences, there are challenges in working with this data across different watersheds. Even sites within the same network of sites often have very different conventions when it comes to naming variables or how the files are provided to the public, what format they're in, how they have been processed. There are challenges associated with gappiness of these data records. And data records that might be on different time stamps. And so it can be difficult to do comparative hydrology with these data sets. This was a challenge that my student Liang Zhang set out to rectify along with my postdoc Adam Mojes. And they worked for several years to develop what we're calling the Comprehensive Hydrologic Observatory Sensor Network, or CHOSEN, which has just, we just published this database that contains all of the sites that you see here, as well as a pipeline for going from downloading the data to generating a netcdf file of the compiled database. And this pipeline is done using best practices in open reproducible science. We published a series of Jupyter notebooks that go through this data downloading, quality control and cleaning, including multiple methods for gap filling, and then aggregation to daily timescales. So what we're hoping is that the community will make use of these resources and add to this database over time, and also update it as new years of data become available. This database is a departure from other popular large sample databases in hydrology. Those databases typically only contain temperature, precipitation, and stream flow. So if you want to consider how that precipitation is partitioned through the water balance, you often need to make assumptions and generate models of, say, soil moisture. But the CHOSEN data set is much deeper in terms of the number of variables that it contains. It contains a lot of data on soil moisture. It even contains some isotope data, although that's much more limited in its availability. So, you know, there's a lot of variability in this data set in terms of the number of years of data that are included within each one of these variables. But despite that, we're hoping that this lays a foundation for the type of comparative observational hydrology that we really need in order to establish baselines in understanding how these systems respond to climate change. So we did a demonstration project with this database that really took advantage of these multiple variables to see if we could say something about changing hydrologic extremes in response to changing climatic extremes. And so one of the things that we needed to do, first of all, was define extreme events. And we defined extreme events as events that exceeded the 95th percentile or the 5th percentile, so high and low extremes, of the seasonally detrended time series. And one of our most basic questions is, are there hotspots across this network of sites and across all of these variables that we're monitoring in terms of sites that are experiencing significant trends in multiple types of extremes? I should also say that we evaluated statistically significant trends using a Mann-Kendall trend analysis, which is standard practice. And so here are results at a glance. There's a lot going on with these bubble plots, but the first thing to focus on is that there's two plots being shown. We looked at trends in magnitude of these extreme events, so both high and low, and also trends in the frequency of high and low extremes. The size of the bubbles associated with each of the site refers to the proportion of available time series that shows significant trends in highs or lows. And then the other thing is we queried what type of hydrological processes these significant trends are likely to be associated with. And so, for example, trends in temperature are associated with the hydrological process of evapotranspiration. There are other things that influence evapotranspiration as well, such as humidity and solar radiation. So those were all lumped under ET, evapotranspiration, as the process. And what you're looking at in these bubbles is not to be interpreted as a pie chart. It's not showing any actual proportions. It's just our way of showing, okay, what were these trends in? The blue outlines are trends in discharge. The up arrow indicates whether that systems are becoming wetter over time. Dry indicates that stream flow is becoming, or down indicates that stream flow is becoming drier over time. And the same goes for the other processes that we're looking at too. So at a glance, you could see that there are really 4 main hotspots across this data set in terms of places that are experiencing a lot of trends and extremes, including the Pacific Northwest, the Northeast, the Southeast, and then Alaska ended up being a hotspot. And we are just operationally defining hotspots as sites with trends in over 2/3 of the monitored variables. The other thing that you notice here is that there's a lot of yellow, indicating that many of the trends will have impacts on evapotranspiration. And this isn't too surprising. The US is, I wouldn't say uniformly, but ubiquitously getting warmer. And you would expect that to be associated with increased evapotranspiration. So one of the things that was really interesting in looking at this overall plot is that these hotspots are very much in line with multivariate climate extreme hotspots that come out of climate models, so predictive climate models. These authors looked at multivariate climate extremes that might be expected by 2050. And you can see from the title that on whole, they're projecting a doubling of US population exposure to climate extremes by 2050. But if you look at this plot with the purple and the red, you see a lot of purple colors in these 3 regions of the lower 48 United States where we also showed hotspots. And so that was interesting. But another question that we were interested in pursuing, going back to how I framed this part of the talk, is, are there associations between stream flow extremes and climatic extremes, or extremes in the related hydrological processes that might allow us to potentially make some inference into what's really driving the changes in stream flow extreme or not? And so one of the things that we did is we just came up with a table of predictions. So if we're following a really simple water balance and we're seeing trends in climatic or hydroclimatic extremes that we expect are related to stream flow, what would the associated trends in stream flow be? And so this is a table of hypotheses for expected correlates to low flow extremes. And let's just take the first row as an example. So if low precipitation frequency goes up, we would expect, if precipitation is a primary driver of stream flow, we would expect that low stream flow extremes would also go up in frequency. So there would be a positive correlation. If low precipitation magnitude goes up, in other words, if the low precipitation extremes are becoming wetter, we would also expect the low stream flow extremes to become wetter, and there would be a positive correlation. So we went through this exercise for both the low flow extremes and the high flow extremes. And the next slide is showing just a graphical way of depicting the results. So what you're looking at here in the bubbles is sites. So the colored bubbles pertain to sites that do see significant trends in this case, low flow extremes. Blue colors mean that those low flow extremes are becoming wetter. Red colors mean that those low flow extremes are becoming drier. And if you see an outline around those points, that means that there is an association with a hydrological process that's consistent with the relationships that were in that table of predictions. And so, you know, this is a correlation, not a causation, but it provides some indication that, for example, changing precipitation patterns might be associated or may be a driver of drier low flow extremes in Idaho and so on. This was fairly interesting. One of the things that you see is that almost all of these points have an association with evapotranspiration. So, and most of these points with that association are red in color. So increasing evapotranspiration seems to be driving drier low stream flow extremes in many regions. We also, one thing that was at least initially surprising to us was that we didn't see many associations with soil moisture, except for at H.J. Andrews Experimental Reserve here in Oregon. But we think upon further reflection that that is an artifact of what ended up being fairly short data records for soil moisture at many of these sites. Many of them did not meet our 10-year threshold for inclusion in the analysis. We went through the same exercise for the high flow extremes, and one of the basic conclusions is that there weren't as many associations as with the low flow extremes. But soil moisture, again, is important at H.J. Andrews, where there's a really robust record, and changing precipitation seems to be associated with changing high flow extremes at 2 of the sites. The other thing that was interesting out of this analysis is that many of the sites in the Southwest, and this is true for both the low flow extremes and high flow extremes, seem to be becoming wetter with respect to stream flow. And that is something that it contrasts with the drier and dry, wetter and wet paradigm, but actually is something that many of the climate models forecast to happen by 2050. This is interesting because past observational studies that maybe ended a decade ago don't show this trend toward wetter stream flow conditions in this region of the US. But our analysis, which is more recent, shows those. And climatologists associate this wetting trend with an intensification of the monsoon for this region. So we might have passed through the point at which that intensification is actually apparent in the data. So I'm going to pivot to my next story, given that we're limited on time here, and talk more specifically about the cascade of other process level interactions that get set off when we do experience these dry hydroclimatic extremes, when we experience drought. So what we've been talking about up to this point invokes this notion of process connectivity. We've been trying to understand the connections between climatic extremes and hydrologic extremes. And what I'm going to be talking about in this next part of the talk also deals with connectivity. What are the ecological and water quality processes that are initiated once drought develops in a particular region. So I'm going to be discussing the Delta specifically, where I would say that drought has had an outsized effect. The Delta itself plays an outsized role in California. Of course, the Delta is this region that we're looking at. It's a part of the San Francisco estuary. It's one of the rare inverted deltas that we have in the world, in which the distributary channels branch out inward toward the land. As you can see, the watershed of the Delta covers much of the state of California, but its importance for people is even larger. For example, it's one of the West's great biodiversity hotspots, and 80% of California's commercial fishery species rely on the Delta, including Chinook salmon and steelhead trout. Water is also pumped away from the southern Delta around the Clifton Court forebay to supply the Central Valley Project and State Water Project, which in turn supply 2/3 of Californians with water and irrigates 45% of the fruits and vegetables produced in the US. So as you can see, the Delta is highly connected to human communities, and on whole, connectivity within and outside the Delta is essential to understanding drought impacts on the Delta. So first of all, just a first order, you cannot divorce the delta from the ocean. The salinity gradient structures the ecology and many aspects of the economics of the delta. And it's important to understand that the connection to the watershed, namely inflows to the delta, is a major driver of that salinity gradient. And you could get a sense for that from this diagram, which shows contours of salinity as a function of distance from the Golden Gate and depth. So as you can see, there's substantial salinity encroachment inland during low flow years, such as those associated with drought. This one comes from the last drought that we experienced. And that encroachment is something that is quantified by the X2 measure, which you see here. So X2 is the location of the 2 parts per thousand bottom salinity isohaline. It turns out that X2, and I should say that X2 is measured in terms of distance from the Golden Gate. That's the unit here. It turns out that X2 is very strongly correlated to the abundance of several estuarine species, including those that you see on this plot. So as a consequence of that, X2 has been used as a formal regulatory metric in the Delta since the 1990s. Water operations within the watershed, such as release of water from the Shasta Dam in particular, are very closely linked to these regulatory metrics for X2. A more recent biological opinion on the endangered Delta smelt also regulates the position of X2 in the fall months. So this measure is really important. And it's also important to understand that the salinity-flow relationship, so the relationship between flow and X2, has been highly altered through the operation of reservoirs and the Central Valley Project and state water project that route water to Southern California. So to demonstrate this, Hutton and Roy looked at historical salinity data from the California and Hawaiian Sugar Refining Corporation, or the C&H Corporation, which operated a refinery in Crockett before the initial operation of the Central Valley Project's Shasta Dam, the largest reservoir in the Delta watershed in 1944. So C&H needed to go up in the Delta to obtain fresh water for their sugar refinery. They were required to use fresh water not to exceed 50 milligrams per liter in chloride. And so they kept meticulous records of how far up the Delta they encountered water that met the standard. And this serves as a proxy for that isohaline. So Hutton and Roy dove into this non-conventional data source to develop a historic pre-water project salinity flow relationship, which is a pretty tight relationship. Their next question is, how has this relationship between salinity and inflow changed as a function of operation of the water projects? And so they constructed a similar curve for the present day, and then looked at the historic record from 1908 to 1929, and evaluated how the position of this X50 isohaline changed from the pre-project time period in black to the current time period in which the water projects are operational in blue. And what this data showed is that water project operations increased salinity associated with particular Delta inflows fairly substantially. So that this just makes the point that inflows are very much tied to salinity, but we've also altered this relationship through our water project operations. And one inference you can make in relating this to drought is that drought decreases inflows, leading to a propensity for the Delta to become more saline. And in fact, I would say that salinity management is our biggest challenge in managing the Delta during drought conditions. And that's because of all of the ecological impacts of salinity. You know, the other big thing is trying to avoid salinization of water intakes in the South Delta down here. You see in orange, these are the intakes for the State Water Project and Central Valley Project. And so our system is highly engineered to support salinity management. And there are several types of operations that are invoked during drought conditions. One is operation or reoperation of the Delta cross-channel gate, which you see here. When this is opened up, fresh water from the Sacramento River gets sent into the central Delta to combat saltwater intrusion in the South Delta. You'll also see these salinity control gates that influence salinity within the Sassoon Marsh. These are largely being operated in support of duck clubs. But then there's the other thing that you're seeing on this map here is an emergency drought salinity barrier, which in 2015 was constructed across the False River in the Central Delta as a way of stopping saltwater intrusion to the point of at the Clifton Court forebay in the South Delta. That salinity barrier has recently been put in again in 2021. And the Department of Water Resources is now embarking on a permitting process for longer term use of this hard rock engineering structure to prevent salinity intrusion. Other actions that are being considered to reduce the threat of salinity, particularly during drought conditions, include constructing similar rock barriers in the North Delta, additional operations of the Delta cross-channel gates, and even a dam across the Golden Gate, which you can see here. Now, one of the things that I'm really emphasizing in this talk is the cascade of interactions, or the cascade of reactions, I should say, that are set off by drought. Many of these processes are also set off by our strategies to manage drought, and particularly our strategies to manage salinity within the Delta. So there was a fairly extensive body of scientific research that took place in association with the construction of the False River salinity barrier in 2015. And that was nicely summarized in a paper by Wim Kimmerer et al. That came out in 2019 in San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Sciences. One of the most striking findings with that study is that when this drought barrier was put in upstream of this region called Franks Tract in the Delta, there was a fairly substantial expansion of submersed aquatic vegetation throughout the open water body. So this red is showing the extent of submersed aquatic vegetation. And that expansion of vegetation was irreversible. It still persists to this day. Submersed aquatic vegetation is something that the Division of Boating and Waterways spends millions of dollars to control. It's a huge management challenge within the Delta. And so just trying to understand processes through which it invades and processes through which it persists is an ongoing area of research, as well as trying to come up with innovative strategies to treat it in an environment that's really tidal, where you might lose many of the herbicides that are put in the water. So there is an alternative to this hard rock engineering that has been considered. So this open water body that we were just looking at is called Franks Tract. And back in 2018, a process was initiated to bring together many stakeholders along with government, state government agencies to develop an alternative strategy for managing Franks Tract that really balances the need to decrease salinity encroachment, to decrease submersed aquatic vegetation coverage, promote recreational opportunities, and also to promote habitat for the endangered Delta smelt. I think this is a great model of how to co-produce management alternatives and then use numerical models to evaluate the outcome, and then bring together a community to analyze the outcome of those models and discuss trade-offs in terms of how we're valuing different aspects of those outcomes. And they converged upon a solution that uses mostly green engineering design, so restored tidal marshes as a way to decrease salinity encroachment, but also to promote these other objectives. Now, that design has obviously not been constructed yet and is a binary alternative to the hard rock engineering salinity barrier that has been put in this year. So there's really a need to do larger scale modeling across the Delta that weighs the costs and benefits of these alternatives to managing salinity. My next slide is just a little video. Let me see if I could get it to run. Okay, I was having a little bit of difficulty. Okay, there we go. So this shows salinity intrusion into Franks Tract today as a function of tidal pulsing versus with the Franks Tract's Futures project implemented. And you can see that that project is quite effective at using green engineering to reduce salinity encroachment into this area. And then the Clifton Court Forebay, which is shown below this figure, is where the intake to the State Water Project and Central Valley Project are. Let me go to my next slide, if I can here. Hold on. I'm having a hard time getting out of YouTube. Just a second. Okay, I think, there we go. So another outcome that has been potentially set into motion through this management alternative, that is the construction of the hard rock salinity barrier, is a harmful algal bloom, which was observed in Franks Tract this past summer. Now, one of the things that surprised a lot of people is that we didn't observe a harmful algal bloom in association with the last time this barrier was installed in 2015. But conditions are different now, in part due to the expansion of submersed aquatic vegetation within Franks Tract, which likely has an additional impact on residence times and may have an additional impact on temperature. Both residence time, long residence time, and warm temperatures are factors that have been associated with harmful algal blooms elsewhere. And so it might be that there is hysteresis in the system that was initiated by this drought management action that we took in 2015. So what precisely causes harmful algal blooms at particular places and particular times is something that is a hot topic of research right now in the Delta. But what is clear is that HABs are a growing concern in the Delta that seem to be associated preferentially with drought conditions. Let me just go ahead and click on this and drag this window over. So this is an animation that NRDC put together to show how harmful algal blooms have been expanding across the US. And let me zoom into California so you can see. So this animation starts in 2008. And you can see that at first there were no harmful algal blooms documented in California, and they've just become a recent phenomenon that are particularly concentrated around the Delta. In fact, just in recent years, the problem has been accelerating. There's been a 464% increase from 2016, from 56 documented blooms to 316 documented blooms in 2020. In 2020 alone, California experienced a 60% increase in reported HABs events from 2019. And of course, HABs are associated with human health challenges and have been associated with many dog deaths across the state of California. So there's been some work to document how drought conditions and other anthropogenic changes might be triggering these harmful algal blooms. Peggy Lehman recently put out a great paper in Quaternary International that used a multivariate approach, so a redundancy analysis, in order to look at how variables like nutrient concentrations, pH, residence times, and variables like X2 might be influencing the prevalence of HABs. And what she found is that there's a very tight correlation when you look across the multiple years of data that she collected. There's a very tight correlation between X2 or salinity, which, as you know, is directly impacted by delta inflows, particularly during drought conditions, and harmful algal blooms. But there's also an effect of water temperature, where HABs are somewhat more prevalent at warmer water temperatures. She also observed hysteresis in the occurrence of harmful algal blooms. And one of her major conclusions is that once harmful algal blooms are established, as triggered by drought years, such as the dry 2014 year, then they will come back even during periods of high stream flow, as in 2017, when the bloom still occurred, but was much smaller. So this is something that is of concern for other ecological processes as well, because microcystis within these blooms has been documented as being toxic to fish, including to delta smelt. So let's talk a little bit more about contaminants in the delta and how those might change with drought conditions. So, before I get there, there's just a quote from Peter Moyle in a paper that he wrote in Spews in 2016, where he cites the suppression of delta smelt, and in fact, we could say near extinction of delta smelt up to this point is presumably at least partly an artifact of drought. The drought of the 1980s enabled the rapid invasion of the overbite clam, expansion of populations of one of the smelt's predators, and also the spread of submersed aquatic vegetation, which reduced the ability of much of the delta to support delta smelt. Contaminants were also invoked in this paper as one of the potential causes contributing to the decline of delta smelt. Contaminants are more concentrated in the delta during periods of drought, during which their toxicity effects on fish might be higher. There's been more recent research out of Suzanne Brander's lab, supported by the Delta Science Program, that has found that higher salinity conditions, as you see during drought, have an interaction with contaminants that influence their toxicity on fish within the delta. I've been thinking a lot about contaminant pulses and how drought might influence water quality in places like the Delta quite a lot lately. Right now, being stationed in Sacramento, I live near the American River. And this photograph doesn't come from our recent storm, but it could have, because when I walked along the river last week after the bomb cyclone, I saw plumes of foam in the river, and there was a lot of macro trash that had washed into the river, which really got me thinking about how this weather whiplash that we're increasingly experiencing, so really dry periods, in our case 212 days without rain, followed by intense rain events or very wet years, might influence water quality in places like the Delta. There really hasn't been much work done on this here, but in a brief literature review that I did, how flood pulses following drought impact water quality has been a topic of research elsewhere. And the results, it's a pretty small body of literature, so they're contained, but they're also fairly consistent from place to place. So these are some of the headlines that came up in a Google Scholar search. We see themes of acidification during flood pulses after drought. We see, this isn't just in peatlands, but many other places, we see drought-induced release of metals from soils, which then are mobilized during subsequent flows into water bodies and into streams. We also tend to see an increase in nutrients, both phosphorus and also nitrate. And some of these effects might be persistent. For instance, after sulfur-associated acidification of groundwater in Australia following a drought, it was found that that acidification of groundwater actually persisted for at least 3 years. In addition, studies have shown that changing precipitation patterns with a shift to more intense rainfall, not just after drought, but in general, are enhancing eutrophication risk. And so it's likely that this is another factor that should be considered in cascading drought interactions. So another water quality constituent that directly responds to drought that has an impact on fish is temperature. It's been long thought that there is a threshold temperature at which Chinook, salmon, smolt that are transiting the delta can't survive, around 20 degrees Celsius. And just recently that threshold was verified with several more decades of telemetry data. During drought years, this is particularly concerning because water is warmer, and oftentimes hatcheries need to use fish to truck, or need to use trucks to move fish around the delta so that they don't experience fatally warm water temperatures as they migrate out to the ocean. Maintaining appropriate temperatures for fish is also another big challenge in managing reservoir operations and outflows from the delta during these drought periods. A cold water pool is maintained behind Shasta Dam to regulate temperatures within tributaries to the delta, and it's also been shown that those inflows do have a statistically significant effect on water temperatures within the delta. So that's just another challenge, because during drought conditions, there's more of a human need for water supplementation from reservoirs, but there's also a big need to reserve that water to maintain appropriate salinity levels within the delta and also maintain appropriate temperatures within the delta. So this has been really controversial, as you might expect. I'm sure many of you have seen signs in the Central Valley about that disparage the use of water for ecological purposes, particularly during drought conditions. The Public Policy Institute of California recently, well, I guess not so recent at this point, but conducted an analysis of how water is allocated through the delta during drought conditions. And here they were looking specifically at that 2014 and 2015 drought. And the system water here shown in the yellow bars is the water that is needed to maintain appropriate salinity within the delta. You can see that that doesn't change very much during drought conditions. But what's really changing here is that ecosystem water is actually much lower during drought conditions, and that's due in part to temporary urgency change petitions that are issued. But there's also a crunch on the delta exports side. And this is just another way of visualizing these allocations of water during drought conditions. So I know I need to wrap up, but I want to leave you with a few charters for the path forward. When there have been a lot of calls throughout the state of California to take drought planning outside the realm of emergency planning. When we enter a drought, agencies are typically all hands on deck to plan for or to deal with that emergency. What we haven't done is come together across agencies and consider management strategies at the scale of the delta in a holistic manner, nor have we considered impacts on human communities, particularly those within the delta, very well. But there's a need to do this in a forward-thinking format that anticipates how we're going to deal with extended drought, or how we might deal with the next extreme drought in this state. And so the Delta Science Program is planning a series of workshops in 2022 that will kick off this process and do it in a co-produced way, a way that brings together various stakeholders together with agency scientists. Another charter is the Science Action Agenda, which is a really important document that helps agencies that fund science within the Delta, not just the Delta Science Program, but all agencies that fund science, to prioritize tackling the biggest scientific uncertainties that we need to fill in order to better manage the system. So this is a document that is guided very much by management questions that we've gone out to seek from the community. And we're getting ready to come out with a public review draft around Thanksgiving of the 2022 to 2026 update to the Science Action Agenda that features actions that are focused on the need to do forecasting and large-scale modeling, the need to understand interacting stressors and feedbacks, the need to forecast and understand drivers and impacts of harmful algal blooms, and also to understand the impacts of contaminants within the delta. So here's just a few ways to get involved. If you're interested in learning more about what's happening with Delta science, I'd really encourage you to join the Delta Stewardship Council listserv. We put out seminar announcements as well as science funding opportunities on this listserv. I also conduct monthly office hours through Instagram Live that are announced on that listserv. For those of you who are students or might be getting ready to enter a postdoc, look for the California Sea Grant Delta Science Fellows solicitation in early 2022. Here we fund research proposals by early career students and postdocs that do directly address priority needs outlined in the Science Action Agenda. And then the other way to get involved for those of you who are more senior are to consider applying or thinking of people who might be good to apply for vacancies we have on our independent science board. We're doing a search for 3 vacancies right now. This is a paid position, but the independent science board has a really big impact on addressing and uncovering priority science issues in the Delta. And, you know, they're really valued from for their independence from any agency and are pivotal to the establishment of trust in Delta science. So with that, I've reached the end and I'd welcome any questions. And I'm sorry I went about 5 minutes long.
Thank you, Professor Larsen. Yeah, that was quite a bit of information, very in-depth. Thank you. There are a couple of somewhat technical questions that we may not be able to really address adequately. So I'd encourage people to reach out to you directly. It appears Deirdre has some, some specific questions about pelagic organism decline, the Vernalis Adaptive Management Program, the impact of San Joaquin flow standard on both halves and submerged aquatic vegetation, et cetera. The one question you may be able to address just in the last couple of minutes we have here, Dr. Bernacki is asking for engineering students specifically, how can they gain the skills and experience necessary in green engineering solutions so that they can positively affect environmental problems?
Thank you, Lee, for that question. It's a really great question. And I would say that universities now are doing a better job in trying to reach out to agency scientists and also people in the private sector who are really the leaders on the ground and designing and implementing these green engineering solutions. So I know that at UC Davis, there is a proposal right now to have a national research and training center that gives students hands-on experience. But if you're not already in one of those programs, I would say a great thing to do if you're interested in how this is being implemented in the Delta specifically would be to join the council listserv. There are many other activities that are relevant. So we're running a seminar or a symposium on adapting restoration to a changing climate in February of the new year. And that seminar is going to be very much focused on green engineering solutions to challenges posed by climate change. Attending something like that is a great way to also start making connections to practitioners in the field. The other thing I would say is that I don't know what career stage you're at, but if the Delta Science Fellowship is a possibility for you, one of the things that we do with that fellowship is we require applicants to cultivate a relationship with what we're calling a community mentor. So this is a scientist that's housed within an agency, and that person may very well have green engineering solutions as a focus of their work. And at the science program, at the Delta Science Program, we do facilitate the establishment of those contacts as applicants are preparing their applications. But that's another good way to get involved. So hopefully I've given you a few ideas.
Yeah, that's great. And it does bring us to the top of the hour. So we'll go ahead and conclude, but many thanks to you, Dr. Larsen, for joining us. And thanks to everybody out in the virtual space for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.